Hello, I'm Phil Candreva on the budgeting faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School. This short video will cover the basics of budget formulation and review. After some introductory remarks, we'll look at two actual budgets and then discuss the review criteria. But first, what is a budget? This is the definition from the Navy's Budget Guidance Manual. A budget is essentially a plan for accomplishing objectives over a specified period of time. And as we go through the budget, we'll be emphasizing that. What's the content of the plan? What are the objectives? Over what period of time? And then that's all put in financial terms, dollars and cents. And so the budget has a description of the program being financed, as well as an articulation of the costs of those funds and the types of funds being sought. Budget policy in general says that procurement appropriations are used to buy entire systems or things, and we fully fund those things, such as ships, aircraft, major IT systems, and so on. Expense type appropriations buy activities that we incrementally fund, our annual maintenance, training, recruiting, and pay. R&D is kind of a hybrid appropriation and has elements of both. This flowchart is derived from the DoD Financial Management Regulation regarding whether some object of expense is categorized as an expense and should be paid for with an expense type appropriation, like O&M, or if it should be classified as an investment and paid for with a procurement or maybe a construction appropriation. And the logic starts in the middle. Is the thing that we're buying designed to benefit future periods? Are we buying some capital asset? And if so, is it expensive? Does it cost more than $250,000 for a unit or a system? If so, then we're dealing with an investment. In some cases, we will buy things that cost less than that, but they're part of what we would call a full funding effort, such as a major modification to something that was previously bought with a procurement appropriation. Most other things, such as salaries, spare parts, supplies, services that are designed to benefit the current period, are classified as expenses. And we budget for these things differently. For investments, we apply the full funding policy. This is a policy imposed by Congress that says that when you're buying one of these capital items, you should not have to rely or depend upon the availability of a future appropriation. You should budget for the full cost of a useful end item in that budget. In contrast, expenses are funded incrementally, for enough funding to do a year's worth of that activity. You might think of it as we fund nouns, vehicles, aircraft, weapons, with full funding, and we incrementally fund verbs, maintenance, training, recruiting, and so on. This chart summarizes these two types of funding. And note that there are some exceptions to full funding. Advanced procurement, multi-year procurement, buy to budget. We'll look at these individually a little later in this video. The table uses the term severable. Something is severable if it can be disaggregated or broken up into components, each of which independently meets the needs of the government. If you think of something like maintenance, as we maintain an aircraft or a ship or something, those maintenance tasks can be separated from one another. But in doing half of the maintenance that the fleet needs over the course of a year provides some benefit. But building half of a vehicle or half of a missile doesn't benefit us. When we put the budget together, it's documented in a specific format to support the information flow necessary up the chain of command and over to Congress, and to benefit decision making. And we'll look at some of these examples in detail later in the presentation. Each budget cycle, 3 budgets are prepared. One that's done in the summertime and reviewed by the military department. One that's done in the fall and is reviewed by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And then there's the final budget that's prepared usually in January to be submitted to Congress in February. When that budget is reviewed by the Service Comptroller or the DoD Comptroller, they apply various criteria as shown here. we're going to apply these criteria to some real budgets as we go along. Should they find some error with the budget, they will mark that budget up, and in some cases, the program office has the ability to reclama that change. We'll talk about that in just a moment. This chart depicts this three-level review process, where a program office or field activity is drafting the budget documentation and submitting it through their major command to the Service Office of Budget. This diagram shows the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Financial Management and Comptroller, but it could have just as easily shown the Secretary of the Army or Air Force. That Service Comptroller will review according to those criteria, mark and adjust that budget as necessary, and then they'll send it back to the program office or field activity to do the next draft of the budget for the OSD review. That'll pass back through the Service Comptroller, and the DoD Comptroller will review the budget, and the CAPE, the Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Group, will review the program, and they'll issue changes. Once their changes are reflected in the budget, then we have the final budget that goes over to Congress. So what about these marks? Well, a mark is simply a proposed adjustment to the budget based on some perceived weakness with that budget. And it's typically preceded by some questions, where the analyst who's reviewing the budget will go back to the office that wrote it and ask some questions. If those questions don't satisfy their concerns, they'll adjust that budget. In some cases, the program office has the ability to reclama that decision and address any errors that may have been made by the budget office. In other cases, for instance, if you make a simple math mistake, you cannot reclama that. We just need to fix it. So let's look at an expense type budget. We'll walk through the formulation of that budget, and then later we'll talk about reviewing that budget. And we're going to use as an example flying hours for the Navy. And this is an example that should resonate with students who may be in other services, because all four of our military services fly aircraft and need the budget for those expenses. But first, it's helpful to think about O&M funding as it falls into a hierarchy. And the first subdivision of an O&M appropriation are called budget activities. And in the Navy, there are 4 of those. And beneath those are what are called activity groups. And there's another layer even below that. So imagine we take BA1, the operating forces, and take that down one more level. This is what we would say. We've got the 5 activity groups, air operations, ship operations, and so on. And then beneath them are sub-activity groups. So within air operations, we have flying, we have training, we have depot maintenance, we have logistics, and so on. So for our example, we're going to look at 1A, flight operations. This is the first page of the flight operations budget. It provides a narrative description of the program financed and some broad information about how large is this program, numbers of air wings and crews, and the numbers of aircraft. Now, the budget's written by a budget analyst, not by an aviator. And so the budget analyst is going to need some assistance in figuring out how much to budget, what are the objectives and goals of this program. Remember, a budget is a financial plan to achieve certain goals. So the analyst needs to work with military planners and operators to put this budget together. In the Navy, we use a model for this budget. The model has 2 components, a requirement component and a cost component. The requirement component asks how many hours do we need to fly our aircraft to do the operational missions that we're asked to do, to train and develop new pilots and to requalify other pilots. And then we have some air support that we need, refueling tankers, for instance. So that requirements model is then multiplied by the cost per hour, which brings us to the second part of the model, which is the cost portion of the model that looks at the various cost elements, historical costs, the effects of inflation, the effects of an aging fleet or maybe a newer fleet. We capture that cost per hour, multiply it by the requirement, and that gives us a total amount. The nice thing about a model like this is you can turn the crank backwards. So once we come up with a total, if that total exceeds the amount of funding available, we can put the amount of funding that is available in, turn the crank backwards, and look at what number of hours we might not be able to fly, or it might prompt us to look at some of those cost drivers to see if we can economize in some way. Once we've put this together, it's now time to go on and formulate that budget. One of the next exhibits in the budget is the reconciliation to last year's budget. So what we're going to do is take the last finished or completed year. In this example, that would be FY14. FY15 is the year that's currently in progress, and FY16 is the year for which we're budgeting and requesting resources. And for FY15, we want to reconcile what we requested to what Congress appropriated to what we're actually doing. And so we can see how this develops. There's two columns of numbers here. One is, how did we get from our budget request that we submitted a year ago to the amount we're actually spending this year? And so we see what the budget request was. We see the amount that Congress appropriated, and there were some reductions as part of the appropriations process. And this is the amount that we're currently spending in 2015. The next column reconciles 2015 to 2016. Why do we need $700 million more in 2016? And that's broken down into two components, actually three components: functional transfers, price changes, and program changes. And let's take a look at some of those. The next page is the budget, and it usually goes on for 2 or 3 pages. It gives the details behind the numbers on the previous page. This box is an example of one of those functional transfers. A certain computer program was managed under a different budget line in the past, and we're moving the resources from that other budget line into this budget line. So among the additional funds needed in 2016 are funds to support this IT system. So they added $379,000. What we would find elsewhere in the budget is a corresponding decrease of $379,000 as this function transferred from the old budget line to the new budget line. We also talked about program increases and decreases. Here's an example. This program needs an additional $190,000 because there's one more work day in fiscal year 2016 than in fiscal year 2015. 2016 was a leap year, and you need to pay people for the day they work, so they requested additional funding for the extra day. Here's a program decrease. They need $8.7 million fewer dollars because they're transitioning from an older aircraft to a newer aircraft, and presumably the newer aircraft costs less to operate, and they're flying fewer hours. Also provided in the budget is information about the scope of the effort that's funded. And here we have inventories of aircraft to help Congress understand why we're asking for the amount of money that we are. And one would expect as the number of aircraft increases, the requirement for funding would increase proportionally. We also provide information about how much we're using those aircraft and the goals that we want to achieve in terms of readiness ratings or the number of hours that a crew flies in a month to maintain proficiency. We also report on the number of people who are supporting this program. Military, civilian, and contractors that all make this flying hour program possible. This chart lists the objects of expense or inputs to the budget. While the last couple of charts talked about outputs or outcomes, outputs being number of hours flown, outcomes being desired readiness rating, this is looking at inputs. How much are we paying for salary, for travel, for supplies and materials? Let's look at one line in particular. This is the fuel line. In FY14, they spent $1.4 billion on fuel. They expect to spend a little less than that in FY15, and about the same amount in FY16. And we see two sources of changes from one year to the next as we reconcile from 14 to 15 to 16. From 14 to 15, there was $32,000, or $32 million rather, in price growth. The price of fuel was higher than it was the year before. There was a negative $325 million in program growth. That means we consumed less fuel. So price growth captures the effects of inflation. Program growth captures whether you're doing more or less activity. Notice the change from FY15 to 16. There the signs are the opposite. The expectation is that the price of fuel will fall, but they're going to consume more fuel. Okay, so that's an example of an expense type budget and how it was put together. Let's now look at budgets for investments. And we're going to shift from this incremental approach to funding, the change from one year to the next, to full funding. What's the total cost to build something? Let's illustrate this difference between incremental and full funding. This chart shows the production schedule for a mythical system. The production plan is ramping up from 3 units in the FY14 budget to 4 and then a steady state of 6. The bars represent the orders placed on contract in 1 year that are not all built and delivered until the 4th year, the lead time for production, say. Given that, assume it's time to craft the FY17 budget, the darker bar. If this budget was programmed incrementally, the analyst would need to compute the vertical dotted box, that is, the cost of the work remaining for the first 3 units from 2014, the 3rd year requirement for the 4 units from 2015, the 2nd year effort for the 6 units from 2016, and the 1st year needs for the next 6 units for 2017. That would be a pretty complicated way to do it. And what if the Congress appropriating this money in 2017 disagrees with the priorities from the last Congress, who appropriated money in 14, 15, and 16? They might not choose to appropriate the money, and the result would be a bunch of partially built equipment just sitting there, which would be unfair to the contractor and adds price risk. It doesn't provide adequately for the military, and it's a waste of taxpayer resources. So instead, we fully fund these items. Under full funding, the analyst will estimate the cost of the horizontal FY 2017 bar, which is the full cost to have delivered 6 useful end items. The items themselves, any support equipment, maintenance plans, spare parts, and so on. Similarly, they would have previously budgeted the full cost of 6 in 2016, the full cost of 4 in 2015, and so on. So as we go and look at procurement budgets, remember we're talking about a full funding policy as modified perhaps by advanced procurement, multi-year procurement, or by the budget authority, and the costs that are budgeted. And this brings us back to your acquisition course, where we looked at various categories of cost for a major acquisition program. And our focus is on the weapon system cost, the flyaway cost of the aircraft or vehicle or weapon system that we're buying, and any support items associated with it. Usually initial spares are budgeted for separately, but are also funded in a procurement account. So let's look at an example. The example I chose was the UH-1Y Venom utility helicopter and the AH-1Z Viper attack helicopter. They have a common airframe and engine and differ only in the systems that are installed on an aircraft, so they're budgeted together. This form is the P40 budget line item justification that talks about total and unit costs, description of the item, and the appropriation sought. And you notice that we have the gross weapon systems cost for all of the items we're buying, and we have unit costs for the individual aircraft that are being procured. Recall we said advanced procurement is an exception to the full funding rule. And advanced procurement allows us to buy things with a long lead item, before we ask for the money for the remainder of the system. So think of it as sort of a down payment for those few items that take longer to get your hands on than the rest, but we don't want to tie up all of the budget authority. And in this budget, there is some advanced procurement. We see that in 2014, they asked for a $60 million advanced procurement to be applied to the 31 aircraft they're going to buy in 2015. And so when they put the 2015 budget together, that said they needed $899 million, they subtracted the $60 million they got the year before, leaving a balance of $839 for the new aircraft. But notice also in 2015 they asked for $63 million to get started on the FY16 aircraft. So in 2015 this program office had a total of $899 million for their FY15 aircraft that came in two deposits, $60 million a year before, the balance now, and then they have a third account, the $63 million for next year's aircraft. In execution, the budget analyst needs to keep those three pots separate. The other exception to full funding is multi-year procurement. Under the rules of fiscal law, we cannot obligate funds that we don't yet have. And so entering into a contract that promises a contractor you'll buy 5 years worth of something would be illegal without permission from Congress. But when we have a stable design, we have a stable manufacturing process, we have a national commitment to buy a large number of this item over a period of time, it makes good economic sense to promise the contractor 5 years worth of work to get a lower price. If we receive permission from Congress to do that, then we can sign a contract that obligates future year money even though we don't have that money yet. The third exception to full funding is buy to budget authority. And this is authority that is usually used for things like munitions, where we're buying hundreds of them at a time. And Congress, if we can get a price break, negotiate well, maybe leverage foreign military sales and get a better unit price, Congress will permit us to buy as many as possible within the amount of funds requested, as opposed to limiting the quantity as well as the funds. This buy to budget authority can be seen on the second page of this program's P40. The second page of the P40 also provides a detailed justification for any changes in the program strategy or costs since the prior year budget. It forms a similar function as the reconciliation of price and program growth we saw in the expense type budget. After the P40 justification documentation, we have the P5 cost analysis that breaks down the cost of the program. The DoD Financial Management Regulations specifies cost elements or a work breakdown structure for each type of procurement. And notice the various categories here for this aircraft. The airframe, electronics, engines, armament, engineering change orders, non-recurring costs, and the support equipment that goes along with the aircraft. After the detailed cost breakdown, the budget provides a procurement history that gives information on contracts. Who awarded the contract? To what company? Located where? What type of contract? The C indicates it was a competitive contract. The abbreviations: firm fixed price incentive fee, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, various types of contract vehicles, and then the timing of those contracts. These acquisition lead times take us to the production schedule that's documented on the P21 form. We can see in this production schedule the engines and helicopters budgeted for in 2016. The engines are expected to be delivered between January and November of 2017, and the aircraft in which those engines are installed will be delivered between October 17 and August 18. Ideally, a procurement budget should request funds for 1 year's worth of deliveries. If you're ordering more than a year's worth of deliveries, you're buying, quote, in advance of need, unquote, and that could be grounds for a budget mark. So let's talk about this budget review now that we have discussed formulating the budget. What does that service budget analyst look at when they review the budget? Again, there are 5 criteria: price, schedule, executability, appropriation cognizance, and consistency. And before we get to those 5 criteria, let's think about when this happens with respect to the overlapping budget cycles. So here the military department is reviewing the FY18 budget in the summer of the year before that budget's submitted, 2016. As they're reviewing that budget, they're going to compare that FY18 budget to the budget that was submitted back in February, the FY17 budget, and look for consistency between those 2 budgets. They're also going to consider what's happening with current year execution of the program. All of this helps tell the narrative or the story of what's going on with this program. So criteria number 1 is pricing, elements that went into determining how much we're asking for. Right? Material and labor cost inflation. The rate of production could impact the prices. If we're buying more faster, we may get a better price than buying them more slowly. Learning curve is that theory that says as you double the number of units you produce, you get better at producing them, and the unit cost should go down. And then there are things dealing with program strategy. Are you using government furnished or contractor furnished equipment? Are you buying new engines or refurbished engines, which was one of the issues in the H1 budget? All of those affect the amount of money you're requesting. And remember, back on the Op 32, we had these categories of price and program growth. And the analyst will look to make sure that we're using proper inflation factors. Here's a real-world example of a program that was putting together their FY17 budget and applied a cost growth factor to their estimates that exceeded the official rates provided in the budget call. The table at the top is what was submitted by the program office. The table at the bottom was recalculated by the budget analyst. Over the 5-year POM, this program was requesting almost $1 million more than they needed to cover the effects of inflation and received a budget mark as a result. Criteria number 2 is the schedule. Expense type budgets, we're looking for enough funding for a year's worth of activity. Investment type budgets, a year's worth of deliveries. So let's look at an example. Here's a program that's contracting for 10 units in 3 successive years. And those years have different delivery schedules. And the question is, are there any issues with what they've done for 15, 16, and 17? Well, if we look at them, we can see that in FY15, they're seeking more than 12 months worth of deliveries. They've got 5 calendar quarters of deliveries. And so that 5th quarter may be viewed as excessive and should move out of the FY15 budget and probably into the FY16 budget. The FY16 and 17 budgets each fall within a year's worth of deliveries. And the fact that 2 of them are being delivered in the quarter ending June of 2019, 2 are FY16 items and 1 is an FY17 item is not an issue. As you can see at this point, they're producing a fairly consistent 1 unit per month. You just don't want to have the 17 one delivered before the FY16 units. So here's another real-world example of a budget that has schedule problems. We see that what they budgeted for in FY15, 8 units, were delivered over a total of 9 quarters. And then in FY16, there were only 2 units that were delivered in 2 quarters. And then in 17, 6 units over 8 quarters. And then in 18, 5 units over 2 quarters. So 2 of those budgets requested sufficient funds for 2 or more years worth of deliveries. So the budget didn't match their production lead time. Here, the analyst would adjust the budget to align the dollars with the program goals so that each year's budget buys 1 year's worth of effort. Criteria 3 is executability. Executability is just asking whether or not this program can do what it claims it's going to do. And there are a number of things that could affect that. The maturity of the technology, contractor capacity and capability. If you're budgeting for less than the production line's minimum sustaining rate, that's not executable. Similarly, if you're budgeting for more than their maximum rate of production, that's not executable. The timing of key events is important. If you're budgeting in an expense type appropriation to award a major contract in the last quarter of the fiscal year, a small delay could push that requirement into the following year, which would render that money unexecutable. You can't obligate it in time, and that would probably lead to a mark. Similarly, planning a new start in the first quarter of the year raises executability questions when we're in an environment where we routinely have continuing resolutions that don't permit a new start under the terms of the CR. So that new start should probably move to the second or third quarter. The fourth criteria is appropriation cognizance, and this is simply looking at the activities and things requested in the budget and making sure that they match the appropriation being sought. Sometimes something may look like operation and maintenance, but it's really research and development. One example on the slide, if you have a modification to something like an aircraft engine, and that modification plan is telling the fleet to take the engine off the airplane and send it to the depot to be modified, that would be funded in a procurement account. But if the modification is minor and could be made during a routine repair, that modification would be funded under O&M as part of the repair. The last criteria is consistency, and there are really three types of consistency that we're concerned with. Is the budget internally consistent? If you are claiming you're flying more hours, are you buying more fuel, for instance? If you are saying that you're adding people, does that reflect in the table that summarizes the number of people working in that program? Second is consistency over time. Does this year's budget correspond to last year's budget, and any differences adequately justified in the description? And third is consistency with related budgets. Is the R&D budget transitioning to production, to procurement? Are the two budgets consistent with one another? In some cases, we have shared programs across services, or all services telling the same story in their budgets. All right, to conclude, we talked about the two main types of budgets, expense and investment types. We talked about the three-step budget submission process to the service, to OSD, and then to the president. We talked about the 5 review criteria and applied them to some real-world budgets. Next, in this module, you should try the online quiz. It's not graded, doesn't affect your grade, but you do get feedback. I recommend you take that quiz to check your understanding of these concepts, and I look forward to discussing these ideas with you in the discussion boards.